Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. In the rugged deserts and mountains of the American Southwest, one man became the embodiment of defiance: Geronimo. The name struck fear into the hearts of both U.S. and Mexican forces, a symbol of unyielding resistance. Born into the Bedonkohe Apache tribe, Geronimo was no ordinary leader. He became the rallying figure for the Apache in their fight against the relentless expansion of the United States and the encroaching settlers who threatened their way of life. After decades of broken treaties, massacres, and forced relocations, the Apache had been pushed to the brink. Yet, despite the overwhelming power of the U.S. military, Geronimo's spirit never wavered. By 1885, the Apache had been driven to the fringes of survival. The U.S. government sought to confine them to reservations, stripping them of their ancestral lands and hunting grounds. But Geronimo refused to surrender. In the summer of 1885, he led a bold escape from the San Carlos Reservation, igniting one of the most daring and prolonged resistances in American history. What followed was an epic cat-and-mouse chase that spanned the border between the United States and Mexico as Geronimo, with a small band of warriors and families, outwitted two nations. For more than a year, the Apache leader evaded capture. His elusive movements, guerrilla tactics, and intimate knowledge of the land kept him one step ahead of both the U.S. Army and Mexican forces. This episode delves into how Geronimo, against all odds, managed to slip the noose time and again, and why his final escape would become a defining moment in the history of Native American resistance. What drove him to continue his fight, even when the odds seemed insurmountable? And what did his defiance mean for the survival of his people? The answers lie in the trail he left behind, one that would echo for generations. Geronimo's resistance did not emerge in a vacuum. The struggles of the Apache people were rooted in the broader context of U.S. expansionism, which was steadily encroaching on native lands throughout the 19th century. The Apache, a group of nomadic tribes, had long inhabited the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. Their way of life, centered on hunting, raiding, and semi-nomadic existence, was gradually being displaced by settlers' railroad construction and government policies that sought to assimilate or confine indigenous peoples. For decades, Apache bands had resisted encroachment, but by the 1870s and 1880s, the pressure from both the U.S. government and the Mexican military had intensified. In 1871, the U.S. government took a decisive step in its efforts to control the Apache by establishing the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a policy aimed at forcing the Apache onto a fixed location. The harsh conditions and poor treatment that followed the scarcity of food, unsanitary living conditions, and inadequate rations fueled unrest among the Apache. Geronimo, a fierce leader known for his defiance, had initially attempted to live under the reservation system, but the relentless pressures of government orders and the constant stripping away of their lands and rights pushed him to resist. The breaking point came in 1877, when Geronimo's family was taken by the U.S. military after a series of raids. This loss, combined with the cruelty he witnessed towards his people, turned him from a reluctant participant into an outspoken leader of rebellion. Over the next few years, he became a symbol of Apache resistance, rallying his people around the idea of freedom, autonomy, and revenge. Geronimo's raids were not just acts of war, they were deeply personal, born out of a desire to avenge the suffering of his people. In the years following, tensions mounted as U.S. military campaigns and new policies continued to strip the Apache of their sovereignty. In 1881, Geronimo and his band of followers made an escape from the reservation, but were quickly caught and returned. Yet, despite the capture, Geronimo's resolve remained unbroken. His actions were fueled not only by the desire to preserve Apache land and culture, but also by the growing recognition that he could no longer live within the confines of the reservation system. By 1885, Geronimo had become the leader of a growing resistance movement. He refused to accept any further compromises with the U.S. government and began making plans to escape the reservation once again. His actions during this period were both a reaction to the immediate conditions on the reservation and a broader resistance to the entire system that sought to strip the Apache of their identity. This resistance was not only about survival, It was about asserting their right to exist as they had for generations. The escape of 1885 was not a spontaneous act, but rather the culmination of years of mounting frustrations and the failure of the U.S. government's attempts to control Geronimo and his band. The decision to break free from the reservation was made with careful planning. Geronimo and his followers knew that they would face the full might of the U.S. Army, but the alternative remaining under the brutal conditions of the reservation was unimaginable. The plan was simple escape into the wilderness, where their knowledge of the land would give them a fighting chance against their pursuers. At the same time, the Mexican government, facing its own internal issues, had become increasingly hostile towards cross-border raids by the Apache. Geronimo's raid into Mexico, which resulted in his escape from U.S. military capture, further complicated matters. Both the U.S. and Mexican governments feared the continued Apache resistance and worked in unison to track Geronimo's band. As the months passed, tensions between the two nations began to rise, creating an added layer of complexity to Geronimo's struggle for survival. The key drivers of Geronimo's rebellion were deeply tied to the economic and cultural forces at play in the American Southwest. The arrival of railroads, the destruction of the buffalo herds, and the expansion of settler communities not only robbed the Apache of their traditional way of life, but also made it increasingly difficult to find food, shelter, and safety. With the loss of their land came the loss of their livelihood and identity. Geronimo's resistance, therefore, was not simply a fight for land, it was a fight for cultural survival. In this environment, Geronimo's escape was both a tactical necessity and a statement of defiance against the forces that sought to erase his people. For Geronimo, the question was not just how to survive. It was how to reclaim his autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. His decision to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in 1885, slipping between the two countries, was symbolic of the broader struggle for sovereignty that the Apache faced. It was also a recognition that as long as they fought on their terms, there was hope. But as the months wore on, and his band was increasingly cornered, the stakes of his resistance grew higher. Would Geronimo's last run be the final act of rebellion for his people? Or would it mark the end of the Apache resistance movement in the American Southwest? The summer of 1885 saw a dramatic turning point in Geronimo's resistance. After years of frustration with the U.S. government's treatment of the Apache and the relentless pressure to conform to life on the reservation, Geronimo and his band decided to make a break for it once again. By this time, Geronimo was not just a leader of his own people, but had become a symbol of defiance for many Apache who were unwilling to submit to the government's will. The move was not hasty, nor was it desperate. It was the result of months of careful planning. Geronimo's escape began with a bold decision to slip away from the San Carlos reservation. On May 17, 1885, he and a group of 33 warriors, along with their families, broke out of the reservation and headed for the rugged mountains of Arizona. The escape was swift, catching U.S. authorities by surprise. Geronimo's knowledge of the land, his deep understanding of the terrain, the hidden passes, and the natural resources gave him a significant advantage. For the Apache, the mountains were more than just geographical features. They were a sanctuary, a place where they could remain hidden and survive. However, while Geronimo's escape was planned, it was not without risk. With the U.S. Army already on high alert, they began to mobilize immediately to track down Geronimo and his band. The immediate reaction from the U.S. military was swift and decisive. General George Crook, commanding the Department of Arizona, immediately sent out a series of search parties, including cavalry and infantry, to pursue Geronimo's group. At the same time, the Mexican government, fearing the continued raids by Apache warriors across the border, also began to mobilize its own forces. The U.S. and Mexican military were both determined to capture Geronimo and bring him to justice. For them, it was a matter of law and order, the preservation of their sovereign territories, and the need to end what they saw as a growing threat to their control over the region. As the chase began, the Apache's mobility became a key factor. Geronimo, already well-versed in the art of evading his enemies, led his band into the rugged, desolate regions of the Arizona deserts and the high mountain passes. The pursuit by the U.S. Army, though relentless, was hindered by the harsh conditions of the Southwest, extreme heat-barren terrain, and the unpredictable weather. Geronimo's band, however, thrived in these conditions. They had an intimate knowledge of the land that allowed them to navigate through the harshest of environments, often evading capture just hours or days before the U.S. forces arrived. The first major confrontation came in late June 1885, when Geronimo and his band were spotted near the headwaters of the Gila River. The U.S. Army's forces, led by Major L.W. Wittenmeyer, made a push into the area. However, Geronimo's group was already far ahead, leaving behind only a trail of destruction. Their raids on nearby settlements, which were quick and brutal, continued to strain U.S. forces. These raids, while strategically significant, were also a way for Geronimo to communicate his defiance. He was not just resisting. He was sending a message the Apache would never be fully subdued. In late July 1885, after several weeks of frustrating searches, the U.S. Army and Mexican forces had still not managed to corner Geronimo. A critical development came when the U.S. military realized that Geronimo's band had crossed into Mexico, further complicating the situation. The Apache had crossed an international boundary, and now both the United States and Mexico were involved in the pursuit. This created a political and logistical nightmare for the U.S. Army, as they had to coordinate with Mexican authorities to pursue the Apache across an even larger swath of territory. It also created a temporary opportunity for Geronimo to evade his pursuers by using the mountainous borderland areas, which offered multiple escape routes and natural hiding spots. For the Apache, crossing into Mexico was both a tactical and symbolic move. It was not only a physical escape from the U.S. military, but also a statement of their continued resistance to both the U.S. and Mexican governments. For Geronimo, the borderlands between the two nations represented freedom, a temporary reprieve, where his people could regroup and survive. However, this border also marked the increasing complexity of the situation. The U.S. and Mexico, despite their differences now, had a shared interest in capturing Geronimo, leading to joint military actions across the border. As Geronimo's group continued to move deeper into Mexico, the political pressure from both sides increased. In August 1885, U.S. forces sent a message to Mexican authorities requesting cooperation in tracking Geronimo. The Mexican military, fearing the Apache raids, responded with troops of their own under the command of General Rafael Chavez, who was tasked with securing the southern border and preventing any further Apache incursions. Geronimo's group, however, remained elusive, slipping in and out of Mexico with remarkable speed. One of the defining moments of this period occurred on August 11, 1885, when Geronimo's band was spotted near the Sierra Madre Mountains in northern Mexico. Major Crook, now coordinating with Mexican forces, sent a combined U.S.-Mexican force to intercept Geronimo's group. What followed was a tense standoff in the mountains. Geronimo's band was able to slip away yet again, leaving the combined U.S.-Mexican forces frustrated and exhausted. This event marked a pivotal moment in the chase. Despite the combined military might of both nations, Geronimo remained elusive. Throughout these incidents, Geronimo's actions were not merely those of a desperate man trying to escape. They were part of a larger strategy aimed at preserving his people's way of life. His evasions were calculated not just for survival, but to send a message the Apache would not be erased. Geronimo's skill as a leader and tactician was undeniable. He understood the value of surprise mobility and his deep connection to the land, and these attributes allowed him to remain one step ahead of the U.S. and Mexican forces. At the same time, his actions began to take a toll on his people. Supplies were running low, and the constant movement through harsh, unforgiving terrain was draining. The toll of hunger fatigue and the relentless pressure of the pursuit began to wear on the Apache band, making it clear that the end of this campaign would not come easily. Despite this, Geronimo's resolve remained unshaken, and his followers continued to stand by him even as their numbers dwindled. By the end of 1885, the U.S. military was beginning to accept that Geronimo's ability to elude them was no fluke. The Apache leader had once again proven that his knowledge of the land and his tactical genius were formidable opponents to the might of the United States and Mexico. Yet, as the chase continued, the question remained, would Geronimo's resilience and leadership be enough to sustain his people, or would the pressure finally break his resistance? The next phase of this struggle would prove to be one of the most challenging of all for Geronimo's band. The summer of 1885 marked the beginning of a prolonged and intense campaign to capture Geronimo and his band of Apache rebels. While Geronimo's previous escapes had been audacious, the challenges that lay ahead were greater than anything he had faced before. With both the U.S. Army and Mexican forces now involved, the stakes were raised, and Geronimo's ability to lead his people through hostile terrain was put to the test like never before. The combined military might of two nations would converge on him in an attempt to end the Apache resistance once and for all. In the early days of the campaign, the U.S. military adopted a coordinated strategy, sending multiple units to track Geronimo across the southwestern deserts and into Mexico. General George Crook, the officer in charge of U.S. forces in Arizona, had extensive experience in dealing with the Apache, and his first priority was to establish a precise understanding of Geronimo's movements. Crook's approach was methodical, using mounted cavalry scouts and local trackers to follow the Apache's trail. The soldiers, though skilled, struggled with the vast, desolate landscape that stretched between Arizona and Mexico, where Geronimo had a significant advantage. Geronimo's knowledge of the terrain was one of his greatest assets. He and his followers knew the desert's mountains and canyons intimately. The Apache had lived in these regions for centuries, and their deep understanding of the land allowed them to move quickly and efficiently, even in the harshest conditions. Geronimo often used the natural features of the land rivers, mountains, and cliffs to his advantage, allowing him to hide in plain sight or evade pursuit by crossing terrain too difficult for the army to follow. His tactics were based not just on speed, but on deep knowledge of the land, allowing him to stay one step ahead even when outnumbered. As the pursuit continued through the summer and into the fall of 1885, Geronimo's band crossed the border into Mexico. This shift in geography created complications for the U.S. forces, as the Apache had now moved into a country with its own vested interest in eliminating them. The Mexican government had long viewed the Apache as a threat, particularly in the northern states of Sonora and Chihuahua, where raids had become a regular occurrence. The U.S. Army now found themselves in a complicated situation, having to coordinate with Mexican military forces to trap the Apache in the borderlands. In August 1885, U.S. and Mexican forces began to work together more closely, launching joint expeditions to track Geronimo across the border. The Mexican government, led by General Rafael Chavez, was eager to end the Apache incursions into their territory, which had been causing destruction and stealing livestock. The collaboration between the two armies included not only a military offensive, but also the sharing of intelligence. The Mexican forces familiar with the local terrain provided valuable assistance to the U.S. Army. However, this partnership had its tensions. The two governments had different priorities and methods, which complicated their operations. While the U.S. Army was focused on capturing Geronimo at all costs, the Mexican authorities were more concerned with suppressing any potential raids into their territory. As September turned into October, Geronimo's band continued to evade capture, slipping through military encirclements with remarkable precision. During this period, the Apache relied heavily on their ability to stay mobile, avoiding direct confrontations with the larger, better-equipped U.S. and Mexican forces. However, despite their elusiveness, Geronimo's band was not without its challenges. The harsh desert conditions, combined with a lack of supplies, began to take their toll. Rations were scarce, and many of the Apache, especially the women and children, were weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Yet, despite the suffering, Geronimo's leadership remained steadfast. By October 1885, the pressure was beginning to mount. U.S. forces, frustrated by their inability to corner Geronimo, attempted to cut off the Apache's access to resources. Major L.W. Wittenmeyer and his cavalry units moved toward the headwaters of the Gila River, where they believed Geronimo might be hiding. However, Geronimo and his followers were already far ahead, moving deeper into the Sierra Madre Mountains. The Mexican military launched operations from the south to try to box in Geronimo. But again, his knowledge of the land allowed him to avoid their traps. In mid-November, a critical encounter occurred when Geronimo and his band were spotted by U.S. scouts near the confluence of the Rio Grande and the San Pedro River in northern Mexico. The Apache had been in the area for days foraging for food, and the U.S. Army was closing in. Geronimo, realizing the danger of being surrounded, made a bold decision. He ordered his band to scatter, with some of the warriors crossing the Rio Grande into Mexico, while others headed for the mountains to the east. This move temporarily threw the U.S. forces off the scent, but it also created further divisions within Geronimo's group, some of whom were reluctant to continue the fight. By the time winter arrived in late 1885, Geronimo's group was in a precarious position. They were scattered, tired, and running low on supplies. Despite these challenges, the Apache continued to carry out raids on U.S. settlements and military outposts, hoping to resupply and send a message that they were still active and capable of resisting. The U.S. military, now working closely with Mexican authorities, intensified their efforts, sending additional units to block the Apache's routes of escape. It was during this period that the Apache began to realize the full weight of the challenge they faced. Geronimo's leadership was critical, but the physical toll on the band was immense, and the pressure from both the U.S. and Mexican forces was wearing them down. By December 1885, after a series of particularly brutal confrontations near the Santa Cruz River, the U.S. Army and Mexican forces were beginning to gain ground. The Apache, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, were forced to retreat further into Mexico. Despite his best efforts to keep his people together and continue the resistance, Geronimo's escape routes were growing narrower. For the first time, it seemed as though his elusive tactics were running out of options. However, Geronimo's refusal to surrender was clear. He would not go down without a fight, no matter how overwhelming the odds. As the new year began, Geronimo's band found themselves in a race against time. The U.S. and Mexican forces were closing in, and the Apache were running out of places to hide. The ultimate question remained: would Geronimo's cunning, his knowledge of the land, and his determination be enough to stave off capture? Or would the relentless pursuit finally catch up with him and bring an end to one of the longest-standing resistances in American history? By early 1886, Geronimo's struggle to evade capture was reaching a critical juncture. The relentless pressure from both the U.S. and Mexican forces had pushed him and his band into a precarious situation. Despite their resourcefulness, the Apache were severely weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and the harsh conditions of the desert. Their once formidable resistance was slowly breaking down, and the band's resolve was being tested as never before. Yet Geronimo's defiance remained unwavering, and he was determined to fight on. In late March 1886, Geronimo and his followers were in a remote area near the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. They had managed to evade both U.S. and Mexican forces for several months, but the toll of the endless pursuit was becoming increasingly apparent. The Apache had lost their momentum. Their once quick, stealthy movements were becoming slower, and their ability to carry out raids was greatly diminished. The U.S. Army, now working in closer coordination with Mexican forces, had intensified their efforts. The Apache band was being slowly encircled, and their supplies were dwindling. The turning point came on March 25, 1886. Major General George Crook, the commanding officer of the U.S. forces in Arizona, had coordinated an ambitious plan with the Mexican military to finally corner Geronimo. Crook's forces, aided by scouts and Mexican cavalry, had tracked the Apache to a remote area near the foothills of the Sierra Madre. Geronimo, aware that his movements were becoming more predictable, made a desperate attempt to break free by splitting his group into smaller, faster-moving units. His hope was that by scattering, some of his people would be able to escape and find refuge in the mountains or the distant plains. However, the U.S. and Mexican forces were ready. They had anticipated Geronimo's tactics and had set up a series of blockades along the potential escape routes. The Apache were now trapped in a small canyon, with the military closing in on both sides. At this moment, Geronimo made his most crucial decision. Despite the mounting pressure and the imminent capture of his people, he chose to lead a desperate breakout attempt rather than surrender. At dawn on March 27th, Geronimo and a small group of his warriors attempted a daring escape through a narrow pass in the canyon. The U.S. and Mexican forces, having caught wind of his move, responded immediately. A fierce firefight broke out, but Geronimo's group managed to push through. Despite their best efforts, the Apache were running low on ammunition and strength. The escape attempt, though bold, proved costly. Several Apache warriors were killed or captured during the fight, and Geronimo himself was wounded in the exchange. The Apache broke out temporarily, but were quickly surrounded again. The combined forces of the U.S. and Mexican militaries closed in on their position with ruthless efficiency. Geronimo's band, now down to a handful of survivors, realized that their options for escape were rapidly running out. The battle for survival had turned from a fight against overwhelming odds to a battle of attrition. The Apache, who had once held the upper hand through their superior knowledge of the land and guerrilla tactics, were now facing the reality of capture. The turning point was not just about the tactical defeat of Geronimo's band, but also the profound realization that the Apache resistance, which had lasted for decades, was coming to an end. Geronimo's decision to fight on despite the overwhelming circumstances was both an act of defiance and a final stand for his people's autonomy. The defeat at Sierra Madre marked the collapse of the last major stand of the Apache against U.S. and Mexican forces. Geronimo had pushed his people to the edge of survival, but the physical and mental toll of continuous flight was too much to overcome. On April 3rd, 1886, Geronimo, battered and exhausted, sent out a messenger to Major Crook, signaling his willingness to negotiate. Geronimo had fought as fiercely as any leader could, but the weight of the Apache's plight had finally worn him down. The messenger, carrying a white flag of surrender, met with Crook's forces. By then, Geronimo's band had dwindled to just 30 warriors and their families, a far cry from the hundreds of followers he had once commanded. The final negotiations took place in the town of Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, where Geronimo officially surrendered to General Crook. His decision to give up was not an admission of defeat in his heart. It was a painful choice born of necessity. The Apache leader understood that continuing to fight would only lead to further suffering for his people, and that the relentless pursuit by the U.S. and Mexican forces had left them with no other options. Geronimo's surrender on April 4th, 1886, marked the end of the Apache Wars and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Native American resistance. The immediate aftermath of Geronimo's surrender was a brutal chapter in the Apache story. His warriors were disarmed and sent to the reservations, while Geronimo himself was taken prisoner along with several other leaders of his band. They were transported to Florida, far from their homelands, where they would be held as prisoners of war. Despite this, Geronimo's legacy would live on. His act of defiance, his leadership, and his refusal to be fully subdued by the forces of two nations became an enduring symbol of resistance for Native American communities. Though Geronimo's surrender marked the end of the Apache resistance, it also ignited a lasting fire in the hearts of many Native peoples who saw in his struggle a reflection of their own fight for survival and sovereignty. Geronimo's last run was more than just a physical journey. It was a testament to the resilience of the Apache spirit and their unwillingness to surrender their identity in the face of overwhelming odds. His surrender was the end of one chapter, but his story would endure for generations to come, continuing to inspire those who would fight for freedom, justice, and the right to exist on their own terms. The surrender of Geronimo in April 1886 marked the end of an era in the Apache struggle for autonomy, but it did not signal the end of the Apache people's fight for survival. Geronimo's capture was seen by many as a decisive victory for the U.S. military and the Mexican government, but the consequences of that victory reverberated for years, affecting not only the Apache, but also the broader Native American resistance movement. After Geronimo's surrender, the U.S. government's response was swift and harsh. Geronimo and his remaining warriors, along with their families, were taken prisoner and transported to various military outposts, eventually ending up in Florida, far from their traditional lands in the American Southwest. This relocation was a devastating blow to the Apache who had long relied on their knowledge of the land to survive. They were now isolated from the familiar deserts and mountains that had sustained them for generations. For Geronimo and his followers, the journey to Florida was not just a physical relocation, it was a symbolic death of their way of life. The U.S. military's treatment of Geronimo and his band was punitive. While they were technically prisoners of war, the conditions they faced were harsh. They were housed in military forts, living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The Apache were subjected to grueling labor, and their attempts to retain their cultural practices such as ceremonies and language were suppressed. Geronimo, once a proud and independent leader, was now under the constant watch of U.S. authorities. His freedom and that of his people was effectively destroyed. But even in captivity, Geronimo's legacy was far from extinguished. He became a symbol of resistance, not only for the Apache, but for other Native American tribes who had experienced similar hardships under U.S. policies. Geronimo's story was recounted in countless oral histories, his name becoming synonymous with resilience and defiance. Even in prison, he managed to assert his influence, speaking out on behalf of his people and maintaining his dignity in the face of adversity. By the end of 1886, Geronimo's band had been broken up. Many of his followers were sent to other reservations scattered across the Southwest. Geronimo himself was placed under the control of military officials in Florida, where he was expected to remain for the foreseeable future. Yet the story of Geronimo did not end with his surrender. His defiance, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, had left an indelible mark on the Apache and other indigenous groups. Geronimo's struggle for survival was now a rallying cry for future generations of Native Americans who sought to reclaim their land, their rights, and their way of life. In the years that followed, the Apache people continued to struggle under the U.S. government's policies of assimilation and forced relocation. The devastating impacts of reservation life, poverty, disease, and cultural destruction took their toll on the Apache population. However, the memory of Geronimo's resistance lived on. His name was invoked in the campaigns for Native American rights that would come to define the 20th century. In the 1900s, as part of the broader push for Native American civil rights, the legacy of leaders like Geronimo was revived. Native American groups began to reclaim their voices, demanding recognition, justice, and autonomy. Geronimo's courage and his refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds became a source of inspiration for these movements. His defiance symbolized the ongoing battle for Native American rights and the survival of indigenous cultures. Even as Geronimo's story gained symbolic importance, the U.S. government continued to implement policies that sought to erase indigenous cultures. The forced relocation of Native peoples to reservations, the suppression of traditional spiritual practices, and the boarding school systems all served to disrupt the cultural continuity of the Apache and other tribes. Despite these efforts, however, the Apache people, like many other Native American groups, found ways to preserve their traditions, their languages, and their identity. Geronimo, in his final years, would become part of a larger narrative of survival and resurgence. As the years passed, Geronimo's later life in captivity took on a different character. In 1898, 12 years after his surrender, Geronimo was granted the opportunity to attend the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. The exhibition, showcasing the achievements of nations and cultures across the globe, invited Geronimo and other Native leaders to participate as part of a display of Native peoples. His participation in the fair was an uncomfortable irony. A warrior who had fought so fiercely for his people's freedom was now being used as an exhibit for the very system that had defeated him. The images of Geronimo at the World's Fair posing for photographs in his traditional dress were seen as a reflection of both the degradation and the continued resilience of Native American cultures under U.S. domination. Despite the public spectacle, Geronimo's spirit never fully yielded to the circumstances of his captivity. His life continued to be defined by the same fierce determination that had driven his resistance. In his final years, Geronimo lived on the reservation in Oklahoma, where he died in 1909. His passing marked the end of an era, but it also highlighted the ongoing struggle for Native American rights and sovereignty. The legacy of Geronimo is multifaceted. On one hand, his life represents the collapse of one of the last great Native American resistance movements. His surrender signaled the end of the Apaches' efforts to maintain their traditional way of life. On the other hand, Geronimo's story became a beacon of resistance for future generations, inspiring countless Native Americans in their ongoing struggle for civil rights, justice, and recognition. Geronimo's legacy persists in the present day. His name is still invoked in Native American activism, and his story remains a key part of the history of the Apache people and their enduring fight for self-determination. In modern Apache communities, his name is honored not only as a warrior and leader, but as a symbol of the strength and resilience of indigenous peoples throughout history. His life and legacy continue to inspire those who fight for the preservation of native cultures and the protection of indigenous rights in the face of adversity. As the U.S. continues to grapple with its historical treatment of Native Americans, Geronimo's story serves as both a reminder of the injustices that were done to indigenous peoples and a testament to their enduring resistance. Despite the policies designed to erase native cultures and histories, Geronimo's name endures a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of the Apache people and the broader struggle of Native Americans for freedom, dignity, and justice. The capture and subsequent imprisonment of Geronimo in 1886 marked the end of one of the longest and most significant resistance movements in American history. His surrender effectively put an end to organized Apache resistance, but Geronimo's legacy would far outlast his time on the reservation. His name became synonymous with defiance and resilience, not only for the Apache, but for all Native American peoples who had endured generations of displacement, violence, and forced assimilation. Scholarly consensus on Geronimo is mixed. Some historians view him as a tragic hero, a leader whose valiant efforts to preserve Apache sovereignty were ultimately defeated by the overwhelming forces of the United States and Mexico. His actions are often seen as emblematic of the larger struggle of Native Americans during the late 19th century, resisting colonial encroachment, forced relocation, and the destruction of their way of life. Geronimo's defiance, particularly his refusal to accept the conditions of the reservation, has led many to view him as a symbol of indigenous resistance, someone who fought not just for land, but for the very survival of his culture and people. Others, however, argue that Geronimo's role in the Apache Wars is more complicated. Some historians have pointed to his often divisive leadership style, which at times led to internal conflicts within the Apache bands. Geronimo's tactics, while effective in the short term, were sometimes criticized as too erratic or confrontational, which may have alienated potential allies within his own people. The exhaustion and fragmentation of his band by the time of his final surrender suggests the toll such a long and drawn-out resistance took on the Apache people both physically and psychologically. Despite the complexities of his leadership, Geronimo's legacy is undeniable. His capture marked the final blow in the long series of Apache defeats, yet it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Native American history. Geronimo became a powerful symbol for the fight for native rights in the 20th century. His resistance against U.S. policies of forced relocation and cultural eradication was a source of inspiration for Native American activists during the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. His name continues to resonate in popular culture, often used to evoke images of rebellion, freedom, and resilience. The most enduring aspect of Geronimo's legacy is the continued struggle for Native American sovereignty and rights. Despite his capture, the Apache people and Native American communities at large persisted in their efforts to reclaim their culture, their land, and their dignity. Geronimo's life and resistance continue to inspire modern-day activists advocating for land rights, language preservation, and cultural revitalization. The ongoing fight for Native American rights can trace its roots back to leaders like Geronimo, whose defiance in the face of overwhelming odds sparked a fire that still burns in many communities today. Geronimo's legacy also extends into the cultural and historical memory of Native Americans. His story is now told not just as a tale of resistance, but as a reminder of the lasting effects of colonization and the strength of indigenous peoples in maintaining their identity. Though Geronimo died in 1909, his name has been preserved in the oral histories, songs, and stories of the Apache people and other Native American communities. His life serves as a testament to the enduring spirit of indigenous resistance, and his actions continue to shape the collective memory of Native Americans who still fight for justice, recognition, and the preservation of their heritage. In examining Geronimo's legacy, it becomes clear that his fight was not in vain. While the Apache may have been forced onto reservations, their cultural survival and continued resistance demonstrate the strength and resilience that Geronimo embodied. His defiance against two powerful nations, the United States and Mexico, remains an indelible part of the larger narrative of Native American history. Geronimo's final run, his ultimate surrender, and the sacrifices made by him and his people all contribute to a legacy that endures in the fight for Native American rights and sovereignty. Geronimo's story, therefore, is not just one of loss, but one of hope, defiance, and survival. It is a story that has inspired generations of Native Americans to continue the fight for their land, their culture, and their future. Geronimo's legacy ultimately is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the spirit of resistance endures and the fight for justice continues. Geronimo's surrender marked the end of an era, but it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter in Native American resistance. His story is far from over. It lives on in the hearts of those who continue to fight for Native rights and cultural survival. As we reflect on his legacy, we must ask ourselves, what would have happened if Geronimo had succeeded in his final escape? Do you think his resistance changed the course of history for Native Americans? Share your thoughts in the comments below.